Whether you know him as Mankind, Cactus Jack, Dude Love, or simply Mick, Foley is the definition of hardcore wrestling. So grab a chair, not to hit anyone with, and let's dive into the career of the guy who's always had a nice day, even after falling off a 16-foot cage. Love him or hate him, you can't deny that Mick Foley is one of a kind. Let's break it all down. But don't worry, we're keeping this easy to follow. All right, let's start with the infamous Montreal Screwjob. If you're a wrestling fan, you've probably heard about this a million times. But let's quickly recap. In 1997, Bret the Hitman Hart was leaving WWF for WCW, and Vince McMahon didn't want him walking out as champion. So Vince came up with a sneaky plan to take the title off Bret without him knowing. During the match at Survivor Series, Shawn Michaels put Bret in his own move, the sharpshooter, and the ref suddenly rang the bell even though Bret didn't tap out. Just like that, the match was over, and Bret had been screwed. Now Mick Foley was furious. He saw this as a betrayal of Bret Hart and everything wrestling stood for. It wasn't just about one match. It was about respect, trust, and treating people the right way. Foley was so upset that he refused to show up on Raw the next night. Think about that for a second. He was one of the top stars at the time, and skipping Raw wasn't a small thing. It was his way of saying, this isn't okay. Now let's talk about something a little spicier. Foley's feud with Ric Flair. These two legends went head-to-head, and it got real personal. It all started when they both wrote autobiographies. Flair threw some serious shade in his book, calling Foley a glorified stuntman and saying his hardcore style wasn't real wrestling. Foley wasn't about to take that lying down. In his book, he clapped back hard, calling out Flair's work ethic and even bringing up some personal stuff like financial troubles and infidelity. Things got heated, and the two didn't hold back in interviews either. At one point, they even had a little scuffle at a book signing. Eventually, they kind of made up, but you can still tell there's some tension when they talk about each other. It's one of those rivalries that fans will never forget. Speaking of Foley's hardcore style, let's get into that. If you know anything about Mick Foley, you know he's the king of hardcore wrestling. This guy put his body through absolute hell to entertain the fans. Thumbtacks, barbed wire, flaming tables. If it was dangerous, Foley probably did it. And of course, who could forget his legendary Hell in a Cell match with The Undertaker? That match is burned into the memories of fans forever. But not everyone was a fan of Foley's hardcore style. Some critics thought it was way too violent and gave wrestling a bad name. Others worried it set a dangerous example for younger fans. Foley, on the other hand, always defended his choices. He believed the violence wasn't just for shock value. It was part of the storytelling, meant to create moments that fans would never forget. Whether you agree with him or not, there's no denying his matches changed the game and left a lasting impact on wrestling. Now let's switch gears and talk about one area where Foley definitely messed up, his past comments about women's wrestling. Early in his career, he said some things that didn't sit well with fans. For example, he once suggested moving a women's match to the pre-show of a big event, which came across as dismissive. He also made some comments about female wrestlers' appearances that weren't exactly respectful. The good news? Foley owned up to his mistakes. He apologized and admitted his comments were insensitive. Over the years, he's become one of the biggest supporters of women's wrestling. He's always praising female wrestlers for their talent and athleticism, and he's used his platform to push for more opportunities for women in the business. It's a great example of how someone can grow and learn from their mistakes. Finally, let's get into Foley's relationship with WWE's creative team, because, oh boy, it hasn't always been smooth sailing. Mick has never been shy about calling out things he didn't agree with, whether it was bad storylines, poorly developed characters, or just plain bad booking. Over the years, he's spoken up a lot, and it's ruffled some feathers. In 2017, things came to a head when he was working as Raw's general manager. Foley ended up leaving the role because of creative differences, which wasn't exactly a surprise. But here's the thing. His criticism didn't come from a bad place. It came from passion. He genuinely cares about wrestling and wants it to be the best it can be, not just for the fans, but for the wrestlers too. When you look at Mick Foley's career, it's clear that he's not just a wrestler. He's a man who cares deeply about the industry and isn't afraid to speak his mind. Sure, he's had controversies, he's made mistakes, but he's also shown us what it means to stand by your principles, grow from your missteps, and pour your heart into everything you do. And that's why, for all the ups and downs, Mick Foley remains one of the most respected figures in wrestling. Whether it's his hardcore matches, his hilarious promos, or his genuine love for the fans, Foley's legacy is one that's impossible to ignore. So what do you think? Do you agree with Foley's stances? How do you feel about the controversies we talked about today? Anyway, if you're a real fan, here is a quick rundown of his epic career for y'all. Mick Foley was born on June 7, 1965 in Bloomington, Indiana, but he grew up on Long Island, New York. Like a lot of kids, Mick loved wrestling. But for him, it wasn't just a hobby, it was a dream. The moment that really pushed him toward it happened in 1983 when he hitchhiked to Madison Square Garden. Yep, he hitchhiked just to see Superfly Jimmy Snuka leap off the top of a steel cage. Can you imagine? That moment was so epic that Mick decided, that's what I want to do. Fast forward a few years, and Mick was training to become a wrestler. He worked with this legendary trainer named Dominic DeNucci, driving hours every week to learn the ropes. He debuted in 1986 under the name Cactus Jack. Now, the early days weren't easy. Mick was mostly a jobber, the guy who makes the other wrestlers look good. But even then, Mick stood out because he was willing to take crazy hits. Like, there's this one match where he got clotheslined so hard he couldn't eat solid food for weeks. He kept going and developed his hardcore style of wrestling. This guy was fearless. Barbed wire, thumbtacks, steel chairs, whatever it took to put on a show, Mick was all in. Fans loved him for it. And his signature move? That elbow drop off the apron onto the concrete floor. It was insane and honestly a little hard to watch sometimes. But that was Mick. He gave everything for the fans. Then came the big break. In 1996, Mick joined WWE, and that's when things got really interesting. This is where we got what fans call the three faces of Foley. Mick didn't just wrestle as one character. He brought three unique personas to life. First, there was Mankind. He was this creepy, masked guy who liked to hang out in boiler rooms. He was weird, dark, and a little unsettling, but fans couldn't get enough of him. Then there was Dude Love, total opposite of Mankind. Dude Love was this hippie dude in tie-dye who was all about having fun. And finally, Cactus Jack made a return. If you liked hardcore wrestling, Cactus Jack was your guy. Each character had its own vibe, and Mick made them all work like only he could. And get this, at the 1998 Royal Rumble, Mick entered the match 3 times. Once as Mankind, once as Dude Love, and once as Cactus Jack. Who else could pull off something like that? It was hilarious and just pure entertainment. But let's talk about one of the most unforgettable moments in Mick Foley's career. His 1998 Hell in a Cell match against The Undertaker. If you've seen it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, trust me, go watch it. Mick got thrown off the top of a 16-foot cage and crashed through the announcer's table. And if that wasn't enough, he got back up, climbed the cage again, and got slammed through the roof of the cage onto the ring mat below. It's one of the most iconic matches in wrestling history. So in 1991, Mick returned to WCW as Cactus Jack, and he didn't just stroll back in, he made a statement. During Clash of the Champions 16, he literally popped out of a giant box and attacked Sting, who was the WCW World Heavyweight Champion at the time. That's Cactus Jack for you. He knew how to make an entrance. This time around, Cactus Jack wasn't the quiet brawler from his earlier WCW days. Nope, he was full-on wild. He'd laugh like a maniac, scream his lungs out while choking his opponents, and constantly shout his catchphrase, "Bang, bang." It was like he turned the chaos up to 11. One of the big highlights from this period was his match with Sting at Beach Blast 1992. It was a non-title Falls Count Anywhere match, and even though Cactus didn't win, Mick has said it was one of his favorite matches ever. If you've never seen it, do yourself a favor and check it out. It's one of those matches where you can see how much Foley poured into his performances. For a while, Cactus was a bad guy, or as wrestling fans call it, a heel. But after a big feud with Paul Orndorff, Harley Race, and Big Van Vader, the fans started to love him. It's hard not to root for a guy who puts his body through so much just to entertain. Now let's talk about Big Van Vader. Vader was a monster, 400 pounds and trained in a style that made his punches and moves look and feel real. Most wrestlers didn't even want to step in the ring with him because they knew it would hurt. But Mick, he was like, let's do this. One of their matches in 1993 ended with Vader powerbombing Cactus onto exposed concrete. Yeah, no protective mats, just straight up concrete. Mick got a real concussion from that and temporarily lost feeling in his left foot. It was brutal. But instead of treating it like the serious injury it was, WCW made up this goofy storyline where Cactus Jack supposedly got amnesia and was institutionalized. Mick hated it, and honestly, so did the fans. It was supposed to be a serious feud, and WCW turned it into a joke. Still, Foley and Vader kept having these insane, hard-hitting matches. At Halloween Havoc 1993, they had a Texas death match that was so violent, even the commentators didn't know what to say by the end. It was one of the wildest matches WCW ever put on, and after that, they decided they couldn't risk putting those two together on pay-per-view again. And then there was the match in Germany in 1994. This one's infamous. During the match, Cactus got his head stuck in the ropes, like really stuck. When he finally got loose, his ear was barely hanging on. And then Vader, being Vader, ripped it off. I'm not kidding. His ear came off during the match. The referee picked it up, handed it to the ring announcer, and the match just kept going. By this point, Mick was getting pretty frustrated with WCW. He felt like they weren't using him right. And after everything he'd done, he didn't see a future for himself there. So in 1994, he decided not to renew his contract. After WCW, Mick found his way to ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling. If you've heard of ECW, you know it was the perfect place for a guy like Mick Foley. ECW was all about hardcore matches with barbed wire, flaming tables, and anything else that could be used as a weapon. Mick thrived in that environment, and fans loved him for it. But it wasn't just about the hardcore matches. Mick also started cutting these incredible promos in ECW. One of his most famous ones came after he saw a sign in the crowd that said Kane Dewey. Dewey is Mick's son, and he was just a little kid at the time. That sign really got to Mick, and he poured all of his frustration and anger into this promo. You could feel how personal it was, and it's still talked about as one of the best promos in wrestling history. Mick also started criticizing hardcore wrestling in his promos, which was kind of ironic since ECW was all about hardcore. But Mick used it as part of his character. He started wrestling in a slower, more technical style just to mess with the fans who wanted blood and violence. By 1996, it was time for Mick to move on again, and that's when he signed with WWF. Vince McMahon wasn't a big fan of the Cactus Jack character, so they came up with something new, Mankind. And oh man, Mankind was weird. He wore this creepy leather mask, hung out in boiler rooms, and acted like a total lunatic. He'd scream, "Mommy," during matches, talk to a pet rat, and pull out his own hair. His finishing move, the mandible claw, looked brutal. He'd shove his fingers into his opponent's mouth and press down on the nerves under their tongue. It looked painful, and according to Mick, it actually was. Mankind's first big feud was with The Undertaker, and let me tell you, those two put on some incredible matches. One of their most memorable was the first ever Boiler Room Brawl at SummerSlam 1996. The whole match took place in the arena's boiler room, and it was absolute chaos. What made Mankind so special, though, was how relatable he was. Through interviews with Jim Ross, fans got to see the man behind the mask. Mick Foley wasn't just a crazy guy in a leather mask. He was a passionate, hardworking wrestler who gave everything he had for the fans. And that's just the beginning of his WWF journey. Mick Foley's story is full of twists, turns, and unforgettable moments. So stick around because there's still so much more to talk about. And as Mick himself would say, have a nice day.